This was Senator John F. Kennedy's campaign ad, and this was Vice President Richard Nixon's.
I would like to talk to you for a moment about dollars and cents. Your dollars and cents. Now, my opponents want to increase federal expenditures as much as $18 billion a year. How will they pay for it? There are only two ways. One is to raise your taxes.
Turn it off.
The other...
Both were running as the primary candidates of the 1960 presidential election to replace incumbent President Dwight D. Eisenhower. As a Democrat, Kennedy's campaign focused on liberal reform and implementing innovative legislation that would resist the upcoming wave of communism. As a Republican, Nixon aimed to continue the strong leadership and American prosperity that Eisenhower had started. Both of them had some pretty convincing campaign promises, and in many respects, the election started off being like any other election. But then came a truly game-changing event, September 26, 1960. Over 66 million people across the United States sat in front of their television sets to watch Nixon and Kennedy kick off what would become the country's first ever televised presidential debate. Not only would it cement who the next president was going to be, but its legacy would permanently influence the US elections that would follow, and in many ways is what makes these ads so important. The 1960 election would be considered by many historians to be the first modern American political campaign, turning the conventionally boring politics essentially into a spectator sport that would appeal to the masses. The debate had a significant impact on all this, but there were a lot of other things involved too. What particularly makes the 1960 election not only so influential, but also a turning point in politics, is that it took advantage of the groundbreaking innovations of the time to change what exactly now mattered in becoming the president. And that was image. In 1960, there was a whole new medium of accessing information at the scene: television. In 1950, 11% of Americans had a television set. By 1959, that number had shot up to 80%. That is 4 out of 5 households owning a television. It was a breakthrough in technology just as incredible as the telegraph in the 1848 election, and eventually the internet in 1996. But with great innovation comes confusion. With television becoming so exponentially ubiquitous, people didn't really have enough time to get acquainted with it. In other words, people were still so unfamiliar with television, they didn't really understand it, and frankly, really know what to do with it. The culture of TV was very different then than what it is now. It was primarily meant for just entertainment. This doesn't mean that there was no news on TV at the time, no one is arguing that. Election night coverage goes as far as 1948, but its role, particularly in politics, was arguably way less prevalent before 1960 came along. When CBS made its decision to air the first presidential debate, it had to replace a time slot initially reserved for the pilot episode of The Andy Griffith Show. This was actually quite controversial. Not because people wanted to watch Andy Griffith instead, though I'm sure that's partly a reason, but because some people felt that television might have a little too much influence on an election. And they're kind of right. Along with the first televised debate came an interesting phenomenon. Public polls revealed that most people who listened to the debate on the radio felt that it was either a draw or that Nixon had won. Those who watched the debate on television felt that Kennedy had won by a huge margin. When viewing the debate in retrospect, it makes perfect sense why. Kennedy appears tan, handsome, and speaks directly at the camera, exerting a lot of charisma, though his voice is more monotone and pedestrian.
Mr. Nixon comes out of the Republican Party. He was nominated by it.
Nixon, on the other hand, doesn't look as good. His outfit blends in with the set, and he looks pale, sweaty, and a bit sickly. He had just gotten out of the hospital for a knee injury and was recovering from the flu. But compared to Kennedy, He speaks with a much better cadence, more emotion, and arguably just sounds more presidential.
And in our case, I do believe that our programs will stimulate the creative energies of 180 million free Americans.
But since 40% of the United States population watched the debate on TV, Kennedy now had the advantage to winning the presidency, and everyone's view on television changed. As broadcaster Bruce Dumont puts it, the innocence of the 1950s ended with bumping the Andy Griffith Show, and the seriousness of the 1960s began with the first Kennedy-Nixon debate. What helped Kennedy so much with this election was that he knew mass media, in a time where it was still primitive and misunderstood. Going back to the presidential ads that we glossed over at the beginning, you can't really blame Nixon for having an ad that was arguably more boring than Kennedy's. His ad was actually a lot more professional than Kennedy's in a lot of ways. But both television and Kennedy showed that that no longer mattered. It was about appealing to the masses. There were still a lot of people that didn't really care for boring old politics. They were busy watching Leave It to Beaver and listening to rock music. There's nothing better than getting more people to vote for you than by being more relatable and adding to your campaign a jingle that people can't get out of their heads. And something like this has been proven to work. The 1984 presidential election was also quite interesting, between incumbent President Ronald Reagan and former Vice President Walter Mondale. Being a former actor, Reagan also knew how to appeal to the masses. How his campaign managed his mass media persona was basically second to none. The way he carried himself was so relatable that even after a news piece did negative coverage on him, his poll numbers would actually go up. His campaign also essentially popularized using sound bites and ads. Along with being president under a recovering economy and so many other factors, Reagan had a great advantage. Mondale wasn't as lucky. With his reputation from the, at the time, infamous Carter administration and openly promising to raise taxes and decrease military spending during the height of the Cold War, the only way he could really appeal to the masses was with a Wendy's slogan. Consequently, Reagan would win his re-election bid in currently the greatest landslide in US history, winning the electoral vote almost unanimously. TV works. Although he made them more commonplace, Reagan wasn't the first to use sound bites for campaign ads. Kennedy did do something a bit similar, albeit more of a video bite, with Eisenhower talking about Nixon's contribution as vice president.
They even want you to believe that he has actually been making decisions in the White House.
If you give me a week, I might think of one. I don't remember. Because
Kennedy communicated in a way that was both clear and relatable to an audience that was now bigger than ever before. Because the practices used in this election were so unorthodox, the results were as well. Kennedy won the election with a pretty nice lead in the Electoral College, but with the popular vote, it was one of the closest elections in US history, with only 100,000 more votes than Nixon. It was also one of the very few cases where Ohio didn't pick the president. Kennedy might have been a clear victor on the electoral map, but he still entered the White House with nearly half the country voting against him. Kennedy continued his mass media presence during his presidency, even televising a tour of the White House. Whether or not Kennedy won the presidency, honestly, is probably best to discuss in another video. But one thing that's certain is that the 1960 election is one of the most influential. It forever changed how the US votes, and that it changed how the US views a president. Less presidential and more like a celebrity or movie star. It was the first time an election was commercial, and as Dumont states it quite eloquently, it wasn't just what you said that mattered, but how you looked saying it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and press the bell icon to get notified on future videos. Also check out my Patreon to gain access to exclusive content.